Good morning. My name is Treg Gilstorf. I'm the CIO at Yaskawa Robotics. I'm also on the board for Technology First. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you here with us today for our 14th annual Taste of IT. Please join me in thanking our sponsors, Diamond, Cincinnati State, Gold sponsor, Cadre Checkpoint Okta, our bronze sponsor, 8451, ComSpark CDO, CyberRabbit, Dell, Exagrid, Extreme Networks, Franklin University, Gigamon, Nexagen, Sinclair, and Smart Data. And to our annual sponsors, ATC, Affidance, CareSource, Cincinnati Bell, Google, Round Tower, UD, WSU, and Uptime. We couldn't do this without your support, and we thank you. All right, let's get started. Our speaker today, Paul, is a creative executive with over 20 years of experience in marketing, design, and development for Fortune 100 product launches. Paul is the author of Virtual Reality and Augmented Reality for Dummies, and has worked in the VR AR space since the release of the Oculus DK1 in 2013. Paul has designed and architected applications for the Oculus Rift, Oculus Quest, HTC Vive, the Samsung Gear VR, Google Daydream, Google Cardboard, Microsoft HoloLens, the ARKit on iOS, the ARCore on Android, and more. He is currently head of digital at Fusion Alliance. Join me in welcoming Paul as he discusses preparing for the future of virtual augmented mixed reality. Paul?
Thanks, Treg. So everybody, I know conferences are a little bit different today than they used to be. It's kind of new to everyone. I like to keep these interactive. So by all means, if you have questions, you can put it in the chat, and I think Treg will field them during the talk. That's correct, right, Treg? If you want to make sure that's correct. I'm gonna take that as a yes, because I actually can't see who all is out there. So by all means, you can put those in the chat, and Treg will kind of field those as they come up. And so before we get into anything, the very first thing I like to do, and I have to do this less and less, but I've had to do this at all the conferences I've been to, less and less as I've been going forward. But I like to share this kind of definition of terms, so we're all kind of working from the same space. So virtual reality is when you're completely immersed in this virtual environment. There's essentially no interaction with the outside world at that point. Augmented reality is when this digital layer is placed on top of this real physical world. So in augmented reality, technically speaking, there's no interaction with the physical world. The digital and the physical are separate. The digital just kind of sits on top. Mixed reality is where the digital and the physical actually get blended together. And the only reason I have this kind of definition of terms up front is because a lot of times you'll hear augmented reality and mixed reality kind of being used interchangeably. At this point, you can kind of think of them as the same thing, but by strict definition, they are actually separate. I actually, at this point, I mix the terms together too. So I'm to blame as much as anyone. An extended reality, or XR, that kind of stretches across all of those things. So as you hear me talk about these things during the talk, you'll know where those terms are coming from. And so I want to give a really quick history of where we're coming from and kind of how we got to where we are today. So in 2013, that's when the Oculus Rift launched their development kit 1. And with that, that was kind of the next big foray, because virtual reality has happened in the past, but it was the next big foray of VR in the consumer space. And it really felt like, this was going to be a big thing. Like books came out about this being the fourth wave of technology. It's going to be bigger than the computer, bigger than the mobile phone. There were a lot of promises of what this technology was going to turn into. And that led to Facebook buying out Oculus. They spent billions of dollars standing up VR. In March of 2016, they launched their first consumer version. So that first version in 2013 was a developer kit. In 2016, the first consumer VR headset was launched with the Oculus Rift. And you had Mark Zuckerberg come out and make the following statement. He said, hey, we're setting a goal. We want to get 1 billion people in virtual reality, which is a pretty lofty goal. And then at the same time, you had Microsoft releasing the HoloLens in 2016, which was the first real enterprise-grade AR headset to come out kind of in this generation. And iOS and Android, they released ARKit and AR Core in 2017 as well. And those were for consumer-grade AR experiences on your mobile device. But then, kind of that same year, or just a few years later, you started to see a lot of articles like these coming out, right? Articles that basically said, hey, it's time to break up with VR. VR's failed. Nothing says VR is dead more than an HTC Vive blog post telling you it isn't. So all of these things that basically, denigrating VR and basically saying, well, VR and AR is dead. And that was after, only a year or two after these launches. So basically they were kind of coming out and saying, these technologies are DOA. So what you have is this really interesting thing where after just 2 years of this technology being launched, I mean, we're still on version 1 of hardware and software, right, at this time. You have people ready to write it off. And for me, it was really interesting to see this evolution of technology in real time as well as people's reaction to it. Because to some extent, it's the equivalent of, when the automobile coming out, people wanting to write it off within a year or two. And the funny thing is, as I dug into it, that actually did happen. So the inventor of the first car ever sold, his name was Alexander Winton. He said he would get mocked for years as being the fool who was fiddling with a buggy that would run without being hitched to a horse. And that was for years after he invented it. So this isn't a new thing that has happened, right? It's as technologies come out, as kind of, world-changing, potentially world-changing technologies come out, that they tend to get written off. And there's a reason for that, and there's a way you can kind of graph that. And so what happens, especially nowadays, where people want a lot more instant gratification, is technologies go through something called this Gartner hype cycle. And the Gartner hype cycle, it provides this graphic representation of maturity and adoption of technology. And what it does is it tries to rely on how these technologies are relevant to solving real business problems. And that explains kind of each stage in the hype cycle. So this very first stage on the far left, you have this innovation trigger. And basically that's the invention of a new technology, new service, whatever it happens to be. So it starts out pretty low. There's zero expectations at that point. But it starts to ramp up as it goes and, as it gets more known. And what happens is it falls into this next stage, and it's called this peak of inflated expectations, where people say, oh, this is going to change the world. This is going to do this and that. They kind of think this technology is going to solve all of their problems. And the reality is, most technologies will never get to this high peak, this lofty peak that everyone wants to ascribe to everything, right? Because nowadays everything needs to be the best or the biggest. And so they have all these inflated expectations on technology. And what eventually happens is people start to see, hey, wait a minute, this isn't going to solve everything. And these has all these adoption problems, and these has all these technological problems it needs to solve. And so it falls into, this next phase, which is this trough of disillusionment. And in that stage, people have kind of fallen off their inflated expectations. They realize, oh, this isn't going to solve all my problems, in which case I'm going to kind of toss it out and ignore it. The phase after that, the slope of enlightenment, is where people start to realize, oh, here's what these technologies actually can be used for. Here's what they are good at. So, you start to see those technologies pick back up. You start to see them solving real world business problems. They start to be used for real things that they can solve, as opposed to, the everything that they could, everything that was being claimed before in this peak of inflated expectations. On the slope of enlightenment, you're starting to see them solve these real world business problems. And finally, for technologies that make it this far, they get to this plateau of productivity where you can actually see, oh, these are what these things are actually good at. For a lot of technologies, it might not reach that peak of inflated expectations because they were so hyped up, in that second phase. A lot of them kind of reach somewhere in the middle, but some of them, like the automobile, they actually surpassed that peak of inflated expectations, right? Like, the automobile's everywhere at this point. So it probably passed even those inflated expectations. Not all technologies go through this, but it's a decent way of kind of visualizing where things are at. And in 2017, this is where Gartner had augmented reality and virtual reality. So it's interesting to see where they saw those at those point. They saw virtual reality as kind of as ahead of augmented reality in its adoption, and people starting to realize, hey, this is what virtual reality is good for. And they had augmented reality not even bottoming out yet as far as the trough of disillusionment, which is interesting. That was back in 2017. And just to compare, this is 2020. So that was their emerging technologies 2017 graph. This is their emerging technologies 2020 graph. And if you'll notice, I left all the other technologies on there because I think it's interesting, especially for this conference to see all those things on there, because some of these things are even being talked about. But you'll notice that both virtual reality and augmented reality have left the chart at this point. And what that means to Gartner is they feel like these are no longer emerging technologies. They feel like we know what the business case uses are, and they actually have moved them on past the plateau of productivity, which is good. I would actually disagree a little bit. I actually think that they are closer to where they had them in 2017. I don't think virtual reality has met its potential yet. I think it's still kind of climbing this slope of enlightenment. And I would say the same thing for augmented reality. You know, I think it's actually probably closer to where they had it in 2017, that it's kind of close to that trough of disillusionment. Now, I fully expect both of them to make it past this. But I do think it's interesting that they pulled that out, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have, maybe in questions as we make it through this. And so, you know, why does that happen? Well, it turns out this technological innovation, it just takes time, right? It's not as easy as just waving this magic wand and saying, okay, you know, this is now going to be adopted, right? There's a lot of technical issues with technology, right? If there's not a killer app for something, it might not be adopted. You can create the best hardware in the world, but without this killer app, you know, why would someone adopt it? Or if it's expensive, why is somebody going to adopt it? There's social issues. There's people learning how to use things. There's people changing from what they're used to. And so Bill Gates has a quote, and he stole it from somewhere else because I've read this a number of places, but I like to use Bill Gates because everyone knows that name. And he said, we always overestimate change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate change that will occur in the next 10. And I think if you go back and look at, you know, some of those websites that I posted, you'll see, hey, these happened within 2 years of these technologies launching. And so they overestimated what VR was going to do within that 2-year space. And what they're probably doing is they're underestimating what VR and what AR are going to do in the next 10. And so knowing that all those things take time, you know, 10 years from the first VR consumer launch, that's 2026. That first launch was 2016. So we have to wait until 2026 to see where VR is. And for AR, you know, that's kind of 2019. And so by 2029, it will be interesting to look backwards and say, okay, where is AR now? I mean, that's a long time scale when you think about it in terms of technology. So I would fully expect a very different world at that point. And so in order to figure out what we need to do as organizations, we need to understand, you know, where we are now in relation to emerging technologies. And this goes for all emerging technologies, right? But part of what I want this talk to be is not just about VR, but just about evaluating all emerging technologies in general. But where are we now with regards to kind of VR and AR? And I think, you know, looking at that Bill Gates 2 years, 10 years, we're in this weird in-between stage with both. So the first generation of VR, that consisted of the Oculus Rift, consisted of the HTC Vive, Google Daydream, those sorts of things. And what I would say is now we're kind of firmly in the middle of the second generation of VR headsets. So you'll see things like the Oculus Quest 2, the Valve Index, things like that. And so what you can do is you can look at where things are starting to shift to see where things are going to go. So Google, originally they had something called the Daydream. It only had 3 degrees of freedom. And so essentially what that means is you would put your phone in the device, you could look around rotationally, and that's all it would track, but it wouldn't track 6 degrees of freedom. And that's where I can actually move about, you know, kind of in Z index space. I can move about my body about. It wouldn't track that. It would only track head rotation. Samsung, they did the same thing. They had a device called the Gear. And Oculus, they did the same thing. They had a device called the Go, and all of these were 3 degrees of freedom, where most of them, you know, took a phone in the device to track that. And these are good flags to pay attention to understand where it looks like VR is going. And again, this is the case for all emerging technology. It's good to see where are businesses investing money, where are things going, so you can start to understand where you should be investing, right? And so where the market's headed with VR, it's pretty obvious that it's headed to wireless. It's pretty obvious that it's headed to devices that can allow 6 degrees of freedom, so that's tracking all degrees of movement. It's pretty obvious that it's headed to inside-out tracking, and so inside-out tracking means you don't need devices to track where you are. I don't need to mount things on my walls. I don't need an extra computer to track all that. I can just kind of put the self-contained device on and go. With mixed reality, with augmented reality, this first generation of devices, they're less evolved than virtual reality was, and there's a number of reasons for that. Mixed reality, they've got a lot more technical problems to solve, so it kind of shares all the same technology issues that virtual reality has to solve, and it includes all these new problems too, like computer vision, understanding the physical environment. Ways to display the real and the physical together seamlessly. So it has all these different problems than just VR does. So this current first generation of mixed reality devices, you could consider it being kicked off with the HoloLens in 2016. But even that was enterprise grade software or enterprise grade hardware. It wasn't really made for the consumer. ARKit and ARCore on your iOS devices, those are made for the consumer, but they were kind of built into devices that weren't really prepared for it. They kind of shoehorned it into a phone. And what you've seen is you'll see lots of interesting experiments on there, but you won't see things that are really, earth shaking or things that really are going to take it AR, its next step in the consumer space. So for MR, you could kind of consider us still in the first generation, maybe this generation and a half. At times I actually think, maybe we're still at, 0.5 generation and we haven't even reached the first generation. And that first generation will be the first AR consumer headset. When that will come out, who knows? There's a lot of talk about Apple releasing an AR headset soon. And I think that something like that is probably going to be the first kickoff of augmented reality. And so to try and track where these things are going, again, you want to pay attention to what organizations are saying and what organizations are doing. And you still have a lot of big players pouring resources into these areas. So Facebook, again, has kind of put their flag in the ground for VR. They're exploring AR in the background as well. Apple is absolutely all in on augmented reality. So Tim Cook has said many things about it. Here's one of my favorite quotes from him about it, which is just augmented reality will happen in a big way. And when it does, we'll wonder how we ever lived without it, like we wonder how we ever lived without our phone today. This quote you can always take with a grain of salt because Alex Kipman is actually the inventor of the HoloLens. But he said the phone is dead, people just don't know it yet, which I think there's some truth to that. Again, what that time scale looks like, that's where it gets a little bit trickier to try and to determine. And so what that all adds up to for us as organizations or as businesses is that there's likely a large scale change coming, right, for how we live and how we run our businesses. And customers, our consumers, they're going to have much greater expectations on, us as businesses, us as organizations. They're going to expect more with regards to new technologies. And so what organizations are going to need is they're going to have ways to evaluate technologies and how those technologies are going to affect their businesses. And that goes for more than just AR and VR. And that's kind of what I'd want you to take away from this talk. That's what I want you to take away more than anything. There's a ton of technologies out there, and you're going to hear about a number of them today. AI, RPA, conversational UI, VR/AR, facial recognition. All these technologies have the way to potentially to fundamentally change the way that we do business. And so as an organization, what's actually most important is to have a strategy not only around VR and AR, which we should because it's coming, but around evaluating emerging technologies and innovation in general. And it's really important that we learn how to do so. And this is another one of my examples that I really like. 80% of organizations in the Fortune 500 20 years ago are no longer on the Fortune 500. Now, some of them have just dropped out, maybe they're at the Fortune 501, but some of them have completely fallen off. And a lot of that is due to failure to adapt to technological change. And so it's important that we, as organizations, we come up with these methods to evaluate technologies on their merits, to determine how we should approach them organizationally. And there's a couple ways to do that. There's this idea of this red queen effect. There's this idea of red oceans, and there's this idea of red teams. So the idea of this red queen effect is when organizations start running or working faster and faster, working harder and harder in this world that no longer exists. And it comes from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Alice says to the Queen, hey, in my country, generally, if you're running fast, if you're working hard, you're going to get to a new spot. And the Queen says to Alice, well, that's very different because here you see it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run twice as fast as that. And where you see that play out is what's called the S-curve of evolution in products or businesses or services. And so as products or services launch, so if you look at kind of that bottom left corner, they're adapted slowly. right? They launch, there's niche offerings, there's early adopters start picking them up. And if it's a successful product, if it's a successful service, what you'll start to see is rapid market growth. So think of something like an Uber, which niche offering at the very beginning got picked up really quickly and experienced rapid market growth. And where it gets to be its most successful at the top of that chart is actually where it's most dangerous to that business, to that technology, to that product. Because what you're going to start to see is Me Too products. You're going to start to see copycat products. You're going to start to see that you hit a performance ceiling. You're going to start to see improvement of your product. Your ability to improve that product or service is going to stall. And you're going to find yourself kind of running faster and faster just to stay in place and just not to fall down this decline. And so in order to survive, what businesses need to do is they need to innovate, and they need to find ways to jump from one S-curve to the other, which can be really difficult to do, especially if you're used to working in one way. If you're an organization that has only knows this single S-curve, has only ever been at the kind of climbing up this or at the top of this S-curve, it can be really hard to decide to invest and jump into a new S-curve, because that next wave of technology, it's actually going to start lower than you are. So you're up here at the top of your S-curve, and in order to say, oh, well, we want to get into VR, we want to get into AR, whatever it happens to be, you're going to have to make a choice to start investing on something that's initially not as good as your current technology, or that's not as good as your current product. And Netflix is a really good example here. So Netflix actually started out as a VHS DVD mail-in service. They decided to jump into streaming early. So their DVD service was up here. They're at the top of their S-curve. And their streaming service was down here when they first invested in it. They actually didn't think people were going to be interested. They thought we didn't have enough bandwidth, and they thought people wouldn't be interested in that service, but they made that decision to actually invest in it. And so eventually what they saw, as we all know, is, initially it wasn't as good, but it improves rapidly, and they essentially jumped that S-curve. So while they still do DVD service, mail-in service, which I didn't know until I looked into it, their streaming service has vastly surpassed that, and now their streaming service is kind of up here on their S-curve. And another good example of where they've kind of jumped again is where they decided to make the jump into developing their own shows. And that's not necessarily a total switch from their streaming service, but it was an investment into something new that was not as good as what they had, right? What they had was paying Disney, paying whoever it was for their shows, and that's how they were existing. But they saw the future, they saw where things were going, and they said, you know what, we need to invest early on developing our own shows. And they did that, and they were kind of able to make that jump. And what they're seeing now is their own shows are paying off as people draw, as other organizations make their own services. Netflix made that jump early enough that it's not facing a total collapse at this point. And so when you exist at the top of that S-curve, if all you do is stay there, what you're going to find is that you live in this red ocean world. And this red ocean world is where companies battle with rivals, and they try and grab a greater share of this product market or demand. And it just starts to become more crowded with businesses, and your prospects for profits and growth, they're reduced because there's so much competition at the top of that S-curve. And to survive, businesses and organizations, they fight over bringing down cost as low as possible, and they exploit existing customers. And what you're going to find is, again, that's just not sustainable. So when you're at the top of that S-curve, you're experiencing the Red Queen effect, where you're just running faster and faster, and you can keep cutting prices to try and compete. But there's a limited amount of customers at that point, and more businesses are jumping in because they see something successful. And so that's just not a sustainable place that you want your organization to stay at. And so in order to survive, businesses want to uncover new products or service line, and they need to find these blue oceans, right, where there's bountiful customer demand, there's less competition for that demand, and you can kind of generate demand with new customers, totally new customers who are previously non-customers. And that's the idea of these blue oceans. And so, what most people will ask is, hey, that's great, but how do we find these spaces? And one way to do that is through this concept of red teams. And so what a red team is, it's a small team explicitly created for looking at the existing setup of your business or product or whatever it happens to be, to uncover what the problems are, identify new solutions, identify new products, whatever it happens to be. You can find ways to improve your existing offerings. You can provide new directions, new solutions via innovation and things like that. And these red teams, they can be really hard for organizations to wrap their head around the need for. Again, because what they see is, hey, we're Netflix, we're successful, we set up this DVD mail-in service and we're doing great. Well, why should we look at anything else, especially something that's actually lower profit margin than our current setup? Well, again, the idea is that these red teams, they're necessary for survival. They're almost something that you have to do in order for your business to stay around. And again, look at the Fortune 500. Look at those 80% of businesses that have dropped out of it in the last 20 years. Most of those dropped out probably because they didn't have these red teams that were evaluating kind of where the winds were blowing and where they needed to be next. You kind of want to skate to where the puck's going to be, not to where the puck is. And following this codified, there's a way you can set up a codified process to do this, right? Because what you want to avoid is this Jeff Goldblum effect. And this Jeff Goldblum effect is this idea that, hey, we formed this red team. We know we need to innovate. And now we're going to innovate with this technology. So we're going to throw technology at a problem and then see if it solves it. We're so preoccupied with whether or not we didn't stop to think whether or not we should, right? And so it's really important that even if you form these red teams, that you follow this process to kind of focus on your customers, focus on where things are going, focus on what your goals are, instead of just innovating for innovation's sake. And there's no one-size-fits-all method for this. So one thing I'll talk about is design thinking here. But what I do want to stress, because a lot of people hear design thinking and I think they get turned off by it. And I think that's understandable. It can be a hard thing to swallow because for organizations, there isn't truly a one size fits all option where you could drop a team in and say, all right, design thinking will work for everything that's going to solve all our ills. But it is one way to uncover innovation inside your business. And so what design thinking is, for people that aren't familiar with it, I'll kind of give a high level outline. So an Apple executive was asked, hey, what is the creative process? Can you draw out the creative process for us from ideation to product? Like before an idea has even come up, all the way to product, what does that look like? And essentially what he drew out was this, which is just, a bunch of scribbles on a piece of paper that don't make any sense from the very beginning until the very end. And we actually think, or I actually think, that this is a mistake, right? This idea kind of reinforces this Moses myth that innovation is this black box, right? And only certain people can think creatively. And one person needs to come up with this grand idea and then bring it down from the mountain and say, this is the way we're going to do everything. And that's just not true. Anybody can think creatively. And in fact, a lot of great ideas come from people that happen to be, thought of as uncreative just because they're on the product side and they get to see all the issues that things have, right? And so design thinking is this idea of a way to try and put some framework around this. And it's a way to try and untangle this mess and empower anyone within the organization, anyone within your organization, to think creatively and follow this systematic process to kind of surfacing these new ideas. And so the way it does it is can kind of be explained in 4 phases. And this first phase is this what is phase. And so this is this idea that all successful innovation starts with this accurate view of what's happening today. And so this is called kind of the what is phase. And that's where, the goal of this what is phase is to help us understand what the current reality is of a problem. It kind of helps us broaden our understanding of what the problem is and what the possibilities are. It helps us uncover unarticulated needs. And our goal here is really, your goal here is really to gather as much information you can as to what is the existing state of the problem. What is the problem, and what have we tried, in the past to try and solve this problem? And the what if stage is next. And the goal of this phase is kind of to generate these multiple creative ideas and explore possible results to those ideas. This tends to be everyone's favorite stage because this is kind of the blue sky thinking stage where everything's on the table. Any idea is a good idea. And so what we do is we use our criteria from what is to start defining the what ifs in this phase. And you kind of allow yourself to start thinking outside of constraints, use our insights and criteria from that data gathering of what is to start defining what these could be. A lot of times we'll give a series of trigger questions to help us think outside the box and generate multiple creative ideas. But again, this is the what if stage can generally be thought of as like the blue sky scenarios of everything's on the table as far as what we could do to solve this problem. And this next phase, the what wow phase, that's where we start to take those what ifs and we start to winnow them down by evaluating our ideas against the criteria of what actually determines a successful idea. So while that blue sky stage was great, it was a lot of fun, we need to find those ideas with this chance of a significant upside, right? Where the idea matches our organizational resources and capabilities and our abilities to deliver that as an organization. So while a flying car might be a great idea for our organization delivery service, our organization might not have the resources to pull that off. So our what if blue sky idea of flying car, again, great, but organizationally, that's not something we could do. But what is something we could do? What are the ideas that will actually work within our organization? So in your what if stage, you might have generated 100 ideas on how to solve your problem, your what is problem. But the what wow stage focuses on, hey, what are those 5 ideas that we can actually move forward with? So we treat each of those ideas as kind of a business concept as a hypothesis, and we evaluate those ideas against this criteria. And you'll find what you're going to find again is you'll have too many concepts at this point, and you'll be able to kind of winnow them down to what ideas actually hit that sweet spot of good ideas we can organizationally execute against, and we can actually move forward with them. And then the what works stage, the goal of this phase is to start prototyping our ideas with actual users. So again, what if stage, we might have had 100 ideas. What wows, we cut that down to 10. What works, you know what, we're going to take 3 of these ideas forward and actually prototype them out and give them to real world users and say, hey, can you try this out? And let's see what ideas fall out of this. So what we want to do is we want to put together low fidelity prototypes to test with actual users. And if they like it, we refine that prototype and we test with more users and kind of on and on and on. So we iterate on these ideas until we feel confident about the value of our new idea and we're ready to scale this idea. So this phase, it should have really quick feedback cycles, should minimize the cost of conducting experiments. We should fail early and we should fail sooner. So the idea of this whole creative process that we're going through is it gives us a way to test ideas really quickly, gives us a way to generate a lot of ideas, up front, winnow those ideas down against criteria that we set, and then actually test those ideas to see, hey, were these good ideas? So instead of making $1 million investments, we're able to make, $10,000 investments to actually test things out and know beforehand, before making these big investments, we actually know, hey, we only spent a little bit of money, but we're able to tell how these ideas can be taken forward and what actually is going to be successful. So what does that mean to you? You or your business with regards to innovation in general, but VR and AR specifically, because these industries are just starting out. It actually puts us in a really good place because we actually get to define where these technologies are headed to some extent. You get to define where they're headed within your organization, and so there's huge opportunity there. Because even small investments and experiments right now with how virtual reality and mixed reality are going to play a role in your organization, that's going to pay off as opposed to waiting until VR and AR again are at the top of that S curve and you trying to kind of jump on board and catch up to it after it's passed. So you get to define your corner of the world for those technologies and take those small steps to decide what sort of level of investment you're comfortable with, testing out how they should play out in your organization. And basically, by starting out now, instead of starting from zero when those technologies finally hit the mainstream, if you starting from zero at that point is going to be a lot more difficult than doing those small experiments now and knowing exactly where you want to go when those technologies do finally hit. So it allows you to plan ahead a bit for those technologies. And so I want to close with again, one of my favorite technology quotes, and this was by Steve Jobs after he saw the first ever personal computer. And it fits as a really good quote for virtual reality and mixed reality and probably some of these other emerging technologies as well. And so what Steve Jobs said was, this is upon him seeing the first ever personal computer. He said, within 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday. It was just so obvious. You could argue about how many years it would take. You could argue about who the winners and losers might be. You couldn't argue about the inevitability. It was so obvious. And that's kind of how I feel about VR and AR, or VR and MR, is that those technologies, they're going to get there. They are going to get there, and we can argue about who the winners and losers might be. We could argue about how many years it might take. Are we 5 years out? Are we 3 years out? Are we 10 years out? Hard to say. But you can't argue about the inevitability of those technologies. And again, it's the same with other emerging technologies. A lot of these are inevitable. They are coming. And so as organizations, as businesses, we just need to prepare ourselves to what that future looks like, as opposed to, again, trying to catch up from zero. And that is all I have. So I'm happy to take questions from Treg, if there are any.
Hey, Paul. I don't see any questions in either the Q&A and chat right now, and I think a number of our participants had to go out to YouTube to watch the session, so that didn't make it as convenient to enter Q&A. So I apologize for that, but I think they're going to have that remedied for the 10 a.m. session. But Paul, what a great job! Really appreciate the content. I thought the session was great. I'd like to give a special thanks to Cadre and Checkpoint, our featured sponsor for this session. Remember, if you would, to complete the survey for each session by finding the link in My Agenda session descriptions. By participating in the survey, you make your voice heard and are helping shape the future of our Technology First events. We really appreciate you filling out those surveys. And now it's time for a 15-minute break, so you can use this time to grab a snack, visit exhibitors, explore the event platform. There are game codes you can earn by exploring the app, so go to the Event Game tab to learn more about that. The game code for attending this session is Reality. So, Paul, thank you again for such a rich session. Really appreciate it, and appreciate everyone who participated, and we will see you soon.
All right, thank you.